Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to wait just another minute. I see people rolling in. Want to make sure everybody has a chance to join before we get started. Thank you so much for being here today. All right, it looks like it may have leveled out, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here. My name's Brandy Reeves. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the moderator of the session today. And I have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. Continuing education will only be awarded to those who view the live session, and you must attend the entire training to receive the continuing education hours. There will be a post-evaluation survey that you'll need to complete in order to receive continuing education credits. There'll be a QR code that you can scan, and then I'll also put the link in the chat. So make sure you click that. For nursing, social work, mental health counselor credits, you must provide your license number and the post-event evaluation survey. And for CHES credits, you must provide your CHES ID. You will receive your certificate for continuing education by email within 30 days of this training. So make sure you get that survey filled out. Throughout the session today, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I also see folks putting where they're from, so feel free to do that. I will be monitoring the chat, and we'll let Dr. Fish know if there are questions that come up. Depending on the nature of the question, I may ask the question and pose the question during the presentation, or I may wait until the end of the presentation. So I think that's all I have before I provide the bio for our speaker. Dr. Jessica Fish is Assistant Professor in the Department of Family Science at the University of Maryland School of Public Health and the Deputy Director for Research and Evaluation of the CDC-funded University of Maryland Prevention Research Center. Her research and scholarship seek to understand the factors impacting the mental health and substance use of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer questioning youth and young adults. She has published over 75 peer-reviewed studies and book chapters on the topic of LGBTQ youth, development, and health. Broadly, her research aims to inform developmentally sensitive policies and programs that promote the health of LGBTQ people across the life course. So thank you so much for being here for Dr. Jessica Fish's presentation.
Thanks so much, Brandy. Thanks for having me. Hello to everyone out there. I love seeing the shout outs. I hesitate to say this, I'm from Michigan, so I do recognize some of the counties that you all are naming there in Ohio. So it's good to be with you all in the Midwest. As Brandy mentioned, my name is Dr. Jessica Fish, and I'm going to be talking to you today about alcohol use among LGBTQ youth and young adults. Before we start, I do want to say that prior to going back to school to get my PhD and becoming a researcher, I was a clinical marriage and family therapist for a few years. So I'm excited to be talking to you all who are out there doing direct services. So thanks for having me. So for the talk today, I'm going to be focusing both on my work as a researcher advocate, along with the research and advocacy work of others on the topic of alcohol use among LGBTQ people. Specifically, I want to situate the current talk with a background on the current evidence on sexual orientation and gender identity, or SOGI identity, related disparities in excessive alcohol use and alcohol use disorders. I'll then review some of the research highlighting the minority-specific factors that drive higher rates of excessive alcohol use among LGBTQ populations, followed by a discussion on some more emergent research on how normative mechanisms contribute to LGBTQ-related alcohol use disparities. I'll then end briefly by reviewing some points related to treatment and evidence gaps, and talk a little bit about what we're noticing in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and LGBTQ young people. It's important that I acknowledge that much of the research I am presenting today is based on cisgender, so that's folks whose gender identity aligns with their sex assigned at birth, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. That's because research on transgender and non-binary populations continues to lag, but is developing. And there's still limitations in the data collected on that population. So we don't have as much research to talk about until recently. That said, there's still much that we can glean from the studies of LGBT people that extend to, in part, the experiences of transgender and non-binary people, with some exceptions, and I'll try and draw attention to those. It is equally important to acknowledge the diversity that exists within the LGBTQ community, that LGBTQ identity intersects with many important other social identities such as race, ethnicity, religion, and others. So for now, I want to acknowledge this diversity, and then it does play an important role in the lived experience of LGBTQ people and is related to their alcohol and substance use. Although research specific to these intersections is particularly lacking and continues to develop. Finally, I want to note that I'll be using acronyms such as SOGI, which refers to sexual orientation and gender identity, LGBTQ to refer to the general population, and iterations therein like LGB to specifically call attention to specific subpopulations. You'll hear me use terms like sexual minority, which tends to be a more research-based term to refer to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and other non-heterosexual people, and terms like gender minority to refer to transgender, non-binary, and other non-cisgender people. I'll do my best to define these terms as I go through, but please feel free to stop me and drop clarifying questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer those as I present. So to start, let's discuss LGBTQ populations and alcohol use. There is now a compelling body of research that showcases elevated rates of underage alcohol use, hazardous drinking, and alcohol use disorders among LGBTQ populations relative to heterosexual and cisgender peers. And we'll discuss in a bit, these disparities are present early in the life course, with many LGBTQ youth reporting earlier onset for alcohol use than their cisgender and heterosexual counterparts. At the same time, these disparities are not uniform for the population, and we typically find that disparities in alcohol use and alcohol use disorders are larger for women and girls relative to men and boys when it comes to sexual minority status. And in fact, many studies do not find alcohol use disparities between heterosexual and sexual minority men. Most often, alcohol use disparities are most pronounced among women, whereas substance use disparities, particularly club drugs, are more pronounced among men. So for example, here is a figure of past month binge drinking among sexual minority and sexual majority adults from the 2015 National Survey of Drug Use and Health, operated by SAMHSA. You'll note that the overall disparity is at about a 10% difference, but that this difference is largely driven by women, So the overall difference, and then you can see that the disparity is really largely driven by women here. And this pattern is pretty consistent across lots of population-based data sources. Research also finds larger differences in alcohol use when comparing heterosexual youth and adults to bisexual people than when comparing heterosexual people to gay lesbian people. So generally, research shows greater health burdens overall for bisexual populations or folks who are attracted to or have relationships with those of more than one gender. And although limited, research is showing greater risk among trans masculine people and trans men relative to trans feminine people and trans women and non-binary people with regards to substance use. More recent research has also identified disparities in high intensity binge drinking between heterosexual and sexual minority youth and adults. For those who aren't familiar, high intensity binge drinking has really been identified through studies by Megan Patrick and colleagues at Monitoring the Future, and reflect drinking at 2 and 3 times the traditional binge rate. So 8 drinks for women and 10 drinks for men within a specific time period. This has been particularly relevant those work with young adults, and particularly young adults in the collegiate context where heavy drinking is very prevalent. This figure is from a study using US national data of high schoolers, where we found that lesbian and bisexual girls reported greater standard, so that's 4+ drinks, and high intensity binge drinking relative to heterosexual peers, whereas bisexual boys showed elevated rates of high intensity binge drinking among boys. So there's that bisexual effect that I was talking about earlier. Among girls, for example, lesbian girls reported rates of high intensity binge drinking at 3 times the rate of heterosexual girls. And bisexual girls reported rates over twice the rate of heterosexual girls. So we see a very large disparity there in terms of problematic and acute high-risk drinking. Importantly, these heavy rates of use are associated with both acute and long-term consequences. Other studies have demonstrated the developmental nature of these disparities, excuse me, these disparities. For example, in one study, my colleague Kara Exton and I find incredibly dynamic age trends in rates of past year alcohol use disorder across groups defined by sexual identity and sex. So this figure is from a study using data from the National Epidemiologic Survey of Alcohol and Related Conditions, which was operated by NIAAA, the NIH, which surveyed 36,000 US adults in 2012 and 2013. Here we estimated the prevalence of past year alcohol use disorder among lesbian, gay, and bisexual compared to heterosexual women and men by age on the x-axis. So this is age group down here. And so alcohol use disorder is defined as reporting 2 symptoms on the DSM-5 checklist for alcohol use disorder. What we find, which is particularly relevant to this group and to others who are interested in working with LGBTQ populations, is that sexual orientation differences in alcohol use disorder are largest for those in their early 20s. Perhaps not surprising, given that we know that it peaks generally for the general population at that time. But importantly, 45% of gay and bisexual men and 35% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual women met the criteria for an alcohol use disorder. So that's technically 1 in 2 and 1 in 3, respectively. These findings suggest that although studies continue to document elevated rates of alcohol use disorder among sexual minority populations, age stratification illuminates points in the life course where risk is particularly high and may be prime opportunities for screening and intervention. Population-based data on alcohol use and, quite frankly, other health indicators among transgender youth have been limited. In fact, the first population-based studies of trans youth health didn't get published until 2017. The most recent iteration of the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is fielded by the CDC, is a national survey of middle and high school students around the country, found, perhaps unsurprisingly, stark differences between cisgender and transgender youth with regard to suicidal ideation, behavior, and depression, as well as marijuana use, alcohol use, and cigarette use. And these differences at the population level have also been found in statewide data in the state of California, in Minnesota, and in Colorado. And still the research among transgender adults are more mixed, with some data finding higher rates of alcohol use and disparities in alcohol use relative to cisgender adults, whereas others do not find differences in alcohol use across gender identity groups. Although this lack of difference may be more related to the design of studies than to actually no differences. In other words, there's still a lot more work to be done in this area. Current research also illustrates that sexual orientation and gender identity disparities are present at a very young age. These figures are from a recent study I conducted with colleagues where we tested age-related differences in alcohol use and heavy episodic binge drinking among heterosexual and sexual minority youth from ages 12 to 18. This sample reflects a statewide population-based data source of middle and high school students in the state of California from 2015 and 2017. So these are recent data. It's a really, really large data set of over 300,000 young people. You'll note that disparities in these data are already present by age 12. So very early on, we already see that there are differences between these groups. And these differences persist and appear to actually accelerate across adolescence, particularly among sexual minority girls, which are represented in the top line here. We also tested these differences across gender identity and saw similar trends, whereby transgender youth reported much higher rates of alcohol use relative to cisgender boys and girls. And again, these disparities were already present at age 12. And here you also see some additional acceleration across differences across age. So you see this widening effect occur for trans youth. We know that early and frequent alcohol use in adolescence is associated with risk for long-term use and disordered use later in the life course. A study by Megan Schuler showed that sexual orientation disparities in alcohol use disorder in adulthood are largely explained by early onset patterns among these youth. And therefore, these early disparities are concerning given the potentials for long-term risk for alcohol use disorder, but also related comorbidities across the life course. It also showcases why you might note increased use among LGBTQ young adults, and then again, across the life course, as these disparities and experiences are already present by the time they end up leaving to go to college or entering the workforce. And so what I argue is that these early disparities warrant strategic initiatives for screening and intervention for these populations in pediatricians' offices and in mental and behavioral health facilities and other types of mental and behavioral health services. So these are early and persistent and deserve a lot more attention at younger ages than we have historically paid attention to them. Researchers and practitioners often use minority stress theory to help understand elevated risk for suicide, substance use, and poor mental health among LGBTQ populations. Specifically, minority stress theory explains that in addition to everyday stressors that we all experience that influence our mental health, LGBTQ people, by virtue of having a stigmatized sexual and/or gender identity, experience unique stressors that include external and enacted stigma, such as discrimination, harassment, rejection, and victimization, but also internal stressors that stem from these experiences of discrimination and harassment and include things like internalized homophobia, transphobia, so self-directed hate and stigma, hypervigilance, and expectations of rejection or the need to conceal, all of which compound everyday stressors to influence poor mental health and greater substance use for this population. And there's a lot of research to support this process. Now, these stressors can be acute, such as getting kicked out of one's home after disclosing an LGBTQ plus identity or being the victim of a hate crime. But often these experiences are more subtle and chronic, such as having to consider or concealing or coming out to a doctor, a counselor, a neighbor, or altering your behavior in certain contexts to eliminate being outed, so acting more masculine or feminine, and experiencing subtle clues in your everyday life that sexual and gender diversity are not accepted or tolerated by overhearing news stories or people at your workplace or in your classrooms or in your communities or in your faith communities who make disparaging comments about LGBTQ people. It is this subtle and chronic form of minority stress that are commonplace for LGBTQ people and are incredibly detrimental to the health and well-being of this population. That said, many are at a point where they are saying, but things are different now, right? Things are better. Don't we expect that the experiences of LGBTQ young people might be different today? And it's true. In some ways, when we reflect on the arc of social change for LGBTQ rights, few societal attitudes and opinions have changed as quickly as those regarding LGB and, to a lesser extent, transgender people and rights. In the period of less than one generation, we have gone from almost complete silence and invisibility prior to the 1960s to greater legal and social acceptance only half a century later. Large-scale social surveys, including the General Social Survey, the Pew Daily Tracking Survey, and the Gallup poll show that attitudes towards same-sex people and their relationships, same-sex marriage and LGBTQ people and their relationships have steadily improved in the last 40 years. And we have witnessed both the repeal of harmful policies, such as Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and the enactment of laws that provide protections for LGBTQ people and their families, such as marriage equality. And the visibility of LGBTQ people in mainstream culture, media, and politics provide additional evidence for just how much things have really changed with regard to LGBTQ people and communities. For example, the General Social Survey, which is a US nationally representative survey that monitors trends and opinions, has been tracking attitudes towards LGBT people since the early 1970s. And this particular line here represents the decline among people in the United States who believe that LGBT people should not be allowed to teach adults in a university setting, which also reflects kind of broader changes in social attitudes. And these changing attitudes, along with the increased visibility of LGBTQ people, provide a historically new possibility, and that is to be out as a teenager. These data points reflect the average age of coming out or disclosing one's not a heterosexual sexual identity to family and or to friends in studies dating back to 1979. An overview of these studies reflect an appreciable and steady decline in the age at which youth come to understand themselves as LGB and come out to family, friends, and communities as LGB. And we have some preliminary data from studies among trans folks that show similar declines in the age of coming out. It is safe to say that changing social attitudes and visibility now afford youth and young adults the ability to understand themselves as LGBTQ at earlier ages in the life course, at a stage in the life course when sexuality and identity are core tasks for development. And thanks to visibility and access to the internet, youth now have the language to understand and define their diverse sexual orientations and gender identities and expressions. And as more youth come out, many people, including some researchers, presume that the mental health vulnerabilities that have been documented among LGBTQ people in research may ultimately be overcome in younger cohorts of LGBTQ youth. That is, that new legal and social acceptance might present new pathways towards health and wellness and positive development for contemporary cohorts of LGBTQ people. To put it simply, that things are better now. But this conclusion actually has not been supported by the data. And instead, a paradox emerges when comparing the arc of social change to the health status of contemporary LGBTQ adolescents. In fact, my colleagues and I argue that the intersection between changing social norms and the declining age of coming out have created a collision between normative adolescent development process on the one hand and individual development for LGBTQ young people on the other. Specifically, as more LGBTQ youth come out in early adolescence, they are navigating cognitive, interpersonal, institutional, and social and cultural contexts in which LGBTQ identities and issues may be particularly complex. Well, what do I mean by this? With the onset of puberty, youth become aware of same-sex attraction and different gender identities and expressions. This occurs at a time when youth are particularly vulnerable to peer attitudes, influence, and victimization. Peers and peer approval matter so much to the self-esteem, well-being, and self-concept of young adolescents more than any other time in life. And peer expectations and policing of quote-unquote normal sex, gender, and sexuality are also incredibly strong during early adolescence, and youth are often socially sanctioned if they violate traditional gender or sexuality norms. Youth at this time are also still actively developing understandings of empathy and ethical and moral reasoning, which leads them to participate and perpetrate victimization and bullying at higher rates than at any other developmental stage. There is, in fact, a lot of research that shows that victimization peaks in early adolescence and declines as youth age, although this is not typically the case for LGBTQ adolescents. And unlike the generations before them, LGBTQ youth today come out at a time when they are financially and emotionally dependent on families of origin and are required to attend school. Compare that to prior generations of LGBTQ people who would often wait until they were out of the home, out of school, and financially independent from their families of origin, which provided them with more resources for coping in instances of rejection or cutoff. And so my colleagues and I argue that with improved social attitudes, LGBTQ youth feel okay to come out, but then are uniquely vulnerable to peers and family who may not accept them in contexts that they cannot leave. And this is supported by research that demonstrates that youth who come out or disclose their LGBTQ identity are more susceptible to peer victimization, family rejection, and family harassment and abuse than youth who conceal those identities. In other words, these broader socio-historical processes of growing acceptance and, with some exceptions, improved policies, now collide with normative developmental processes in ways that make contemporary LGBTQ youth vulnerable to poor mental health and substance use, just like the generations of LGBTQ people before them. With this point in mind, I want to be quite clear that I am not saying that LGBTQ youth should not come out. In fact, even with increased victimization and harassment, there is research that also shows that youth benefit from disclosing their LGBTQ identity and finding support for that identity. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm drawing attention to the fact that youth are now coming out in contexts that have not adapted to the degree necessary to support them and their positive development, that we still have a lot of work to do to make context more affirming and supportive of LGBTQ youth. So you might be wondering the relevance of this developmental perspective for LGBTQ substance use, but my take is that it's important to consider the context in which your current and upcoming cohort of LGBTQ youth grew up and how this context shapes their alcohol and substance use. For me, it's a both and, right? We've experienced enormous social change and youth are still experiencing stigma in ways that drive disparities in mental health and alcohol use at a critical time in the life course. where mental and behavioral health services are critically needed. So let's take a little bit of time to look at the data from some of the studies that we've been doing to see what's been going on. So these figures are from a trend study that I had conducted with some colleagues, looking at alcohol use among lesbian, gay, and bisexual students using the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is middle and high school students in the United States. So data from 2007 are reflected in the dark green, and data from 2015 in light green represent prevalence rates of lifetime alcohol use, past 30-day use, and past 30-day heavy episodic binge drinking for boys and girls, respectively. So when you are comparing the 2 years, it is immediately apparent that there are promising declines in alcohol use among youth from 2007 to 2015, which supports findings from other studies on trends of adolescent substance use in the United States, like Monitoring the Future or the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. However, when we stratify these results by sexual orientation, like we do here, what we find is that the rate of decline across the 2 time points is less robust and less consistent for sexual minority youth relative to heterosexual youth. The asterisks next to each subgroup denote statistical declines in the prevalence of alcohol use across the 2 time points within each sexual minority subgroup. So for heterosexual boys, you'll note a statistical decline in rates of lifetime alcohol use from 2007 to 2015. And when you're looking across all sexual identity subgroups, you'll note that only heterosexual youth report consistent statistical declines across all indicators of alcohol use from 2007 to 2015. We did, however, note statistical declines for bisexual boys and girls in 2 of the 3 indicators, yet gay, lesbian, and unsure youth, so youth who are questioning their sexual identity, did not evidence statistical declines in alcohol use across the 8-year period. And these same patterns of stability and the disparities that we see were also present in a study that we did on cigarette use between heterosexual and sexual minority youth. These figures represent the prevalence of lifetime cigarette use among youth in the Youth Risk Behavior Survey from 2005 to 2015. And again, we see the same overall pattern of decline across all groups. But note that the gap between heterosexual and sexual minority subgroups of youth remains statistically stable over time. And we have replicated these studies using representative school-based data from British Columbia, Canada from 1998 to 2015, a context that is presumably more accepting of LGBT youth, and find similar results. And others have shown these same patterns of stability in these disparities that are present in mental health, suicidality, and known mechanisms of sexual minority health disparities, such as victimization, bullying, and parental support or lack thereof. So overwhelmingly, these papers suggest an alarming degree of stability and in some cases widening of sexual orientation disparities in substance use, mental health, and mechanisms of these disparities from the late 90s to today. And although we observe some statistical narrowing across studies, these patterns are not consistent across samples and are usually related to statistical power. So more importantly, these studies emphasize that the social determinants of LGBTQ substance use remain present. And these issues related to the developmental collision that I've been talking about are also critical when we consider that we observe that in addition to coming out earlier, more youth are understanding themselves to be sexually and gender diverse than ever before. Many of you likely saw the news headlines a few months ago where the Gallup poll found that 1 in 6 people in Generation Z identify as LGBTQ. And in fact, when you look at change across generations, the trend is fairly pronounced. With each generation, more people identify as LGBTQ, and in the most recent generations, Generation X, Millennials, and Generation Z, we actually see an acceleration in the number of people who understand themselves as LGBTQ as they get older, particularly post-marriage equality, with almost 16% of Generation Z self-identifying as being a part of the LGBTQ community. And what about today's generation? In Generation Alpha, we find similar, if not even higher numbers of LGBTQ representation. Here are the data from the most recent National Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which was fielded by the CDC and collected in middle and high schoolers across the country in 2017, or this one actually is 2019, I believe. Yes, 2019. And it finds that 3.4% of youth identify as transgender or questioning their gender identity, and 15.7% identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or questioning their sexual identity. So at this point, it hasn't already been implied, these data reflect current and upcoming cohorts of young people who are attending your services, who are engaged with your services, who are engaged with your organizations and centers, and reflect a cohort raised in a time of both high visibility, but also stigma and the health consequences of that stigma. And so this model still holds. And as LGBTQ college students traverse university settings, their earlier experiences with stigma shape and influence their vulnerability for alcohol use in the university context. The stressors of the stressors of young adulthood can further compound these processes, especially for those who are still trying to navigate their LGBTQ identity and find support that affirm that identity. There was a question in the chat about Generation Alpha. Generation Alpha is the generation who's in middle and high school right now. They're typically born post 2005 to 2010 and on. Although there's some arguments depending on what generational map you're looking at. So I want to also talk about the idea that stigma is only part of the story here. Although sexual minority stress undoubtedly plays a role in alcohol disparities, the literature has been criticized for, the literature as in the scientific empirical literature has been criticized for inattention to developmental and social factors that may also contribute to increased substance use among sexual minorities. I'm going to talk about a few of these mechanisms, many of which are documented very well in a recent systematic review by Boyle and colleagues on the normative mechanisms implicated in sexual orientation-related disparities in substance use. And why I focus on these is because I think they are really good targets for prevention and intervention. So these include, these include alcohol norms, social and contextual factors, motivations and expectations, attitudes and perceived harms, and childhood victimization and ACEs. We'll tackle each of these in kind. So many of you may be familiar with social psychological perspectives of alcohol use norms, which relate to the various normative influences of alcohol use, typically conceptualized at 3 levels of analysis. There are perceived norms, or a person's perceptions of behavioral and attitudinal norms in their peer group, which often guide future behavior. Within that, there are prescriptive norms, which reflect people's perceptions of how much alcohol their peers use, and their injunctive norms, which refers to a person's perceptions of whether their own alcohol use behaviors are approved of or deemed acceptable by their peers. And these norms have been strongly linked to alcohol and substance use behavior in the general population. And these perceptions are in contrast to actual norms, which reflect the reality of alcohol use in a person's peer group, and the distance between these two, which reflect the discrepancy between someone's perceived norms around alcohol use and the reality of this use within their peer group, whereby people often overestimate the degree to which peers use and approve of alcohol use. I always use the example of whenever you're watching a popular show, it's almost in every episode that you see someone drinking alcohol, and it just kind of gives this picture that people use alcohol constantly in their day-to-day lives, when that's generally not the case for the general population. In the context of LGBTQ folks, research has found that lesbian, gay, and bisexual college students actually tend to perceive that their peers consume more alcohol and are more approving of alcohol use and misuse than their heterosexual peers. So they see this kind of comparison feature. They think that LGBT people consume more and are more approving of that use. In one study, they found that these elevated perceptions of alcohol use were strongly related to LGBT students' own alcohol use, and partially actually explained disparities in alcohol use between heterosexual and sexual minority college students. Other studies have also found that LGB women, so lesbian, gay, and bisexual women, are more likely to perceive greater use among lesbian, gay, and bisexual peers than to heterosexual peers. And again, this elevated perception of use was strongly related to their own alcohol use. Interestingly, they found that perceptions of other LGB women's use was a much stronger predictor of participants' own use as sexual minority women than their perceptions of how much alcohol heterosexual women used. So they were able to say that if you think LGB women are using alcohol at greater rates, that's a much better predictor of how much you're using if you also identify as LGB. So one potential strategy to address these disparities to help normalize the actual amount of alcohol use that peers use, particularly lesbian, gay, and bisexual peers. And there's actually some intervention testing going on right now where folks are trying to do just that, trying to normalize the amount of alcohol use that in-group members used as a way to decrease use among individual people. Social and contextual factors also influence use, and there's evidence to support this for LGBT alcohol use as well. Excuse me. Several studies, for example, highlight that greater LGBTQ community affiliation and participation, so how much you engage with the LGBTQ community, things like LGBTQ saturation of persons in your personal network, and engaging in LGBTQ related events and venues such as bars or related social events tend to increase alcohol use. Other studies have also shown that LGBT people perceive attendance and engagement with bars and clubs as more normative than heterosexual people. So for example, in one study, they found that compared to 15% of heterosexual women, 30% of lesbian and bisexual women reported visiting a bar in the previous month, so twice as high. And this is likely a vestige of gay bar culture, LGBTQ bar culture from the 60s, 70s, and 80s that have kind of carried forward, where many LGBTQ events and gatherings are situated in LGBTQ affirming bars and clubs, or are adjacent or affiliated with LGBTQ bars or clubs or other spaces where alcohol use is very prevalent. For many, this is also some of the only ways to guarantee meeting LGBTQ peers and a potential dating partner. And so there's more proclivity to engage in these contexts that tend to have alcohol there. And that might is one of the contributing factors to why we potentially see elevated rates for this group. So many of you are likely familiar with theories related to motivations and expectations of alcohol use. So much like the general population, LGBTQ people who report drinking to cope with stress are more likely to engage in excessive alcohol use and have an alcohol use disorder than those who do not drink to cope with stress. Some studies among youth also find that LGBTQ youth who report drinking to fit in with peers are more likely to engage in alcohol use even relative to their heterosexual peers. That's a really strong motivating factor for some. Other studies find that sexual minorities discuss how they use alcohol use as a social lubricant to engage in LGBTQ related events, as a motivation and expectation that's complicated by stigma and internalized homophobia and transphobia, right? I did a qualitative study years ago where we would interview people from older generations, and a lot of these first stories of going on dates or hooking up with members of the same sex or gender, there's alcohol involved because it allows folks to be able to dampen the kind of stigma or homophobia and transphobia that they're feeling in that moment. Other LGBTQ people also discuss their motivations to engage in bars and drinking to meet people and partners, and they see this as part of their socialization and engagement with LGBTQ community. I participated in a gay softball league when I lived in Austin, Texas, and alcohol was very much a part of that culture. And every Sunday after the games that we would always go to a sponsoring bar, right? This is part of that community vestige that is kind of present in some of these instances. And there's a lot of narratives around when people come out. One of the first things that their friends do is take them to the gay bar, right? And so there's just kind of this constant context in which alcohol and other substances are very prevalent. And you're sort of entering in that context that can really start to increase availability and usage that could eventually turn into problematic use. Although less studied, it's worth mentioning that studies have also shown that sexual minorities tend to have more accepting attitudes towards heavy drinking relative to heterosexual people. And more recent research has found that sexual minority and transgender youth perceive alcohol and substance use as less harmful to their health than their heterosexual and cisgender peers, which partially, at least in one study, explained disparities in use. So these general attitudes and views towards alcohol use tends to be more favorable. And it's not like these things are unrelated, right? These motivations, expectations, perceptions of harm, the context in which people come to meet one another and be in community with one another, these things are all interrelated, but start to create cognitive schemas and patterns of behavior that increase risk for substance use. Finally, I want to talk about abuse, violence, and victimization, which are considered major life stressors and are consistently linked with long-term adverse consequences, including hazardous drinking and alcohol use disorder. Sexual minority men and women are at increased risk for childhood abuse compared to their heterosexual counterparts, thereby further increasing their risk of developing alcohol-related problems. So in the example presented here, Tonda Hughes and her colleagues in a 2010 article analyzed data from a national sample of adults. The results support findings from previous studies, which suggest that sexual minority women and men are at higher risk for childhood victimization than their heterosexual counterparts. Lesbian and bisexual women were more than twice as likely as heterosexual women to report any lifetime victimization. Lesbians, gay men, and bisexual women also reported greater numbers of victimization experiences. Importantly, women who reported 2 or more victimization experiences in their lifetime had 2 to 4 times the odds of alcohol dependence and drug use disorders as women who reported no victimization. And lesbians who reported childhood neglect had more than 30 times the odds of an alcohol dependence disorder than heterosexual women who reported neglect. So these are compounding features of stress. Although gay men, particularly in this sample, were significantly more likely than heterosexual men to experience forms of victimization, for some reason in this sample, those experiences were not linked to greater risk for substance use disorders. So you can see how these facets, including norms, LGBTQ culture and community, personal experiences, and expectations converge to influence alcohol use among LGBTQ young adults, and how these normative factors are complicated by stigma and stress related to stigma. Part of addressing LGBTQ alcohol use, therefore, is specific to exploring the unique experiences of LGBTQ people and stigma, but to also consider how the community and perceptions of the community influence people's own beliefs and behaviors about alcohol use. So with that, I want to spend just a few minutes discussing treatment evidence and gaps for LGBTQ people. Given the unique needs of LGBT people seeking treatment, there is a mounting case for offering LGBTQ specific treatment strategies. So work by John Bachenkis in a randomized control trial, for example, demonstrated that LGBT adaptive cognitive behavioral therapy programs reduced depression, anxiety, and alcohol use problems more than waitlist controls. And there is also qualitative evidence about lower levels of satisfaction among LGBTQ clients in quote unquote traditional programs, substance use programs that do not address LGBTQ experiences, but they also show better outcomes for LGBTQ people in LGBTQ specific programs or programs that address issues related to LGBTQ identity, or at least even just acknowledging that that identity is part of the lived experience of the folks in that program. And we know that LGBTQ people are more likely to persist in treatment when they have LGBTQ specific or sensitive services. Unfortunately, many programs and treatment approaches do not consider or incorporate LGBTQ specific factors. In fact, many providers and programs lack LGBTQ sensitivities in their care. So in a national study of mental health and substance use service facilities, a graduate student that I worked with, Natasha Williams, and we found that only 12.5% of mental health facilities and 17.6% of substance treatment facilities offered any LGBTQ specific services based on a self-report. We were also interested in how the presence of these LGBTQ specific resources match the population density of LGBTQ people in the United States on a state-by-state basis. So she assessed the relationship between the presence of these services using state-specific prevalence rates of LGBTQ people. So you'll see on the x-axis there, so across the x-axis, more percentage means greater number of LGBTQ people living in a given state. Fortunately, we did find that the percentage of LGBT people in a given state was positively associated with the number of mental health facilities within that state that offered LGBTQ specific services. But for substance use treatment, we did not see a relationship between these factors. So even in areas where even in states with high density of LGBTQ people, we did not see a relationship where the substance use treatment services were able to accommodate that by having increased presence of LGBTQ specific services and programs. So basically identifying a treatment gap. So given the increasing number of LGBTQ people in the United States population, specifically among younger people, and the continued presence of LGBTQ-related disparities in alcohol use, misuse, and other substances, I wanted to offer a few considerations for treatment and services. These include assessing, acknowledging, and understanding LGBTQ populations and their experiences, specifically around stigma, trauma, and its relationship to alcohol or substances. Service providers should be willing to explore LGBTQ-related stigma, support, and community connection, and how these experiences are both resources, but also potentially triggers or contexts that may influence alcohol and substance use. Examining students' examining folks' prescriptive and injunctive norms, social environments that they find themselves in, their motivations or expectations of substance use, and attitudes towards alcohol and substance use, and how you might normalize and address discrepancies in folks' norms compared to actual norms within their peer groups, and discuss how these environments and motivations may influence their own behaviors and attitudes around substance use and alcohol use. And many of you likely already do this, but to be prepared to discuss and assess childhood experiences, including childhood victimization, family rejection and neglect, and other ACEs as they contribute to alcohol misuse and disorders later in the life course. And generally, it is important to acknowledge how LGBTQ identity plays a role in the lives of your clients that you work with, while not overemphasizing or over-attributing behaviors to the experience of these identities. This tension tends to get easier the more you educate yourself on the community and their experiences, and the more you work with these clients. Given the current context, I would be remiss to not at least mention some of the work that we've been doing in the area of LGBTQ populations in COVID-19. At the start of the pandemic, I worked with a group of students, and we were able to field a national non-probability survey of LGBTQ college students and their experiences during the early months of the pandemic. What we found was that there were definitely unique experiences for LGBTQ young people during the pandemic, right? We all had experienced some change in our day-to-day lives, and we were all experiencing stress, but there were some unique things that came out of this study and other studies that I've done since then. And these include feelings of being disconnected from LGBTQ communities specifically, limited access to LGBTQ affirmative spaces and services, rejection and hostility from unaccepting families, and many discussed feeling recloseted after, again, these are youth and young adults, having to go home after being out in the workforce or at school. Importantly, these experiences were associated with changes in mental health and subsequently substance use during the pandemic. We also found that LGBTQ young people who moved in with their parents during the pandemic, or who were relegated to homes with parents after not being able to go to school, had greater increases in psychological distress than LGBTQ students who did not have to move back home, and were more likely to report victimization in the home. So while we see increases in alcohol use across the country as a result of the pandemic, some populations and age groups may have been uniquely impacted and may be dealing with consequences of this alcohol misuse moving forward. So it's important that those working with youth and young adults are aware of these unique circumstances and experiences, and how they may complicate health, well-being, and academic or work success for LGBTQ youth and young adults. Now that we are, continue to be in this environment that's ever changing. And with that, I want to say thank you again to the organizers for inviting me to come and speak with you all. And I believe we can field questions for the next 15 to 20 minutes or so.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Fish. It was a really great presentation. And we do have a question that was posted. So I'm going to read this here. It says, specifically for the ACEs study in relation to substance use and sexual orientation, were the rates of childhood abuse to orientation taking into account the known orientation of the person when they were younger, or was it their known orientation as an adult?
Right, great question. So a lot of these studies of adults, they're reporting their current sexual orientation, and then they're reporting past experiences of victimization and ACEs. But rarely do these studies ever capture information about whether or not they were even aware of that identity or had shared that identity. And so this is independent of those reports. More recently, particularly in studies that have started post 2015, although there were some before then, We have data now that allows us to capture those earlier experiences of awareness and disclosure and how that might shape health across the life course. But we are collecting that data now, and we won't know the long-term effects of that for a while.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. If there are other questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A tab.
I know a lot of you are, most of you, I'm assuming, are working in direct services. And so along with questions, I'd also just love to hear your perspective working with members of your community. I know that someone had just put something in the chat. Thanks for that.
All right, we have another question here. What factor does religiosity play in the intersection of LGBT youth and alcohol use? Religions less accepting of LGBT people tend to be less accepting of alcohol.
Right. So I'm gonna say that it's complicated. I'm gonna say that we actually have just scratched the surface in understanding how LGBTQ populations intersect with various diverse religious orientations to influence mental health. We have very little work that looks at substance use in this context. But general patterns show that LGBTQ folks who are engaged in religious or spiritual communities that are affirming of that identity tend to show really positive outcomes relative to LGBTQ folks and youth in particular who are in communities that have non-affirming stances or harmful stances on LGBTQ identity. There really isn't a ton of research on how this impacts substance use, although you can gather how it might. And I don't know how much in terms of different religious kind of norms around alcohol use then would additionally influence that. It's a good question, but I do want to say too that this a lot of times in the LGBTQ community and folks who are thinking about the LGBTQ community and their wellness tend to just brush aside this idea of religion. But for some, this experience within religious or organized religion can be harmful, but for many, it can be a really, really big strength. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and growing empirical evidence that showcases the powerful nature of religion and spirituality for LGBTQ folks. And you see a lot more LGBTQ affirming churches and religious organizations that become an incredible source of resilience and strength for this community too. So I just want to say it's a complicated story, and scientifically we are still learning about how these experiences shape health, wellness, and in particular substance use. Sorry, I was kind of punting that, but there's really not a lot of great data out there.
Thank you. We have another question that came up. Do you feel as though more, quote, sober socials would be beneficial when considering the data?
Yes, I do. As someone who studies youth and young adults predominantly, I think there is a huge need for particularly those who are 19, 21, 22 up until their early 30s spaces that are LGBTQ centric and affirming, that are not bars and clubs. I know in the work that I do with teenagers and adolescents that LGBTQ community-based organizations, and there are quite a few of them throughout the country, even in suburban and rural spaces, are a great sober space for LGBT youth to find community, meet one another, support one another, access services. But that tends to get a little bit harder as you get older. Folks tend to age out of those programs. And then they often find themselves going into these into bars and clubs to meet folks and to be in these LGBTQ centric spaces that are bar adjacent or have alcohol. But there has been a big push to try and create spaces that are community gathering areas that don't serve alcohol. And so that's something that I think greatly need.
Thank you. And it looks like someone has their hand up in the chat. I'm not sure if you're able to ask your question live. or if you want to maybe put it in the chat. Okay, well, it doesn't seem like there are any other questions, but Dr. Fish provided her email, so I'm assuming that I don't want to volunteer you for this. That
you can volunteer. Yes, please feel free to reach out. I'll respond to them as best I can. Sometimes I'm quicker than other times, but I'm always really happy to talk with folks who are doing direct services and who are working with communities. And so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want to share the work that you're doing. I know that there's another housekeeping slide here that I just wanted to post as well for you, Brandy.
Thank you so much. Yep, I was just going to put the survey and link in the chat as well. So the recording and any supplemental materials will be available on the Prevention First website. You're welcome to scan the QR code here, or you can also click the link in the survey link in the chat. Please make sure you complete that survey. Evaluations are required to receive continuing education credits. And don't forget that for nursing, social work, and mental health counselor credits, you must provide your license number in the post-event evaluation. And thank you so much to Dr. Fish, and thank you to everyone for being here.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the great questions. I appreciate it.